In our next talk, in film censorship in the Treasure State, the law of 1907, Daniel Wells will examine the conditions, content, and people that brought out the nation's cutting-edge film censorship laws into passage. Daniel holds an MA from the University of Houston and taught community college for 12 years. Originally a medievalist, Daniel has been researching Montana history for the past decade.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Indeed. I'd like to begin this with my first number. I'm not used to talking with a microphone, so in medieval history, our conferences are smaller. And I have a confession to make, and that is that I am secretly still a medievalist. So I'm living a double life. And so I just want to let you know that. So in the interests of full disclosure. So today I'm going to talk about a particular law that was passed, and what is peculiar about this law. Well, there's many things that are peculiar about it. But what is peculiar about this law is that it was never enforced, as far as I know. So why are we talking about it in the first place if it was never enforced? Well, I'm going to talk about it because it is something that Montana was on the cutting edge of, because other states are not going to pass similar laws until years later. And the other thing is that this gets to a number of issues, broader issues, none of which I'm going to really answer in this particular paper, because that's above my pay grade. But there's a number of questions which this brings up, and one of which, many of these actually are things we're still dealing with. So it gets at the question of when and to what extent people in Montana accepted new technologies. And in this case, we're talking about moving pictures. And as many of you know, in the period between 1900 and 1920, there was a great deal of technological advance going on. In that regard, they're kind of similar to today. Things may have moved a little slower, but they still had the same problem of here's all this stuff coming in. How do we deal with it? And the second thing is that it underlines, and I think you all know about this, our state's unique political atmosphere, which still exists. We kind of go our own way quite often. And in this case, of course, we have the passage of this censorship law before other states do. And this study is going to add very little, but it will add to the debate, the old debate about whether it's nurture or nature which influences human behavior, and particularly criminality. Now, what they would have meant by environment, or what's, the nurture part of it, includes physical surroundings. For example, the quality of housing, were there enough parks for little Bobby to play in? Substances is part of the environment that people lived in. Alcohol, drugs, cigarettes. There's a big anti-cigarette campaign going on during these years because it was believed that it led to all sorts of juvenile delinquency. And as part of the environment, we also look at media, or they looked at media. Newspapers, books, of course, moving pictures, and advertising. There's going to be a law passed in this same legislative session that the censorship law was passed, which deals with advertising, especially for people's medical problems, and especially with regard to male and female problems. This law sought to ban language that was too explicit, because children might see these advertisements as well. So environment was very important in the period that we generally call the progressive era in American history between 1890 and 1920. And some people say, well, no, they argue about the dates, but let's not worry about that. It was during this time period that people began to look at the environment as a determinant in human behavior, probably more than at any time in the past. It's not the first time, because we have people in the early 1800s who are designing, special communities. Here we go with the environment again, where people could flourish. So it's not the first time that people are looking at environment as a element in determining people's behavior. But it certainly becomes central to people's thinking in this period between 1890, 1920. So we're not going to solve any of those problems, but I just wanted to sort of touch on this to sort of underline the importance of this study. Let's see if I can get this to work here. So, whoops. Hello.
Play something or just advance?
I'm just going to advance it a little.
Just stick with this.
We just use the right arrow.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'm a little late on this, but this is the significance of this particular bill. So here's the text of the bill, and I'll let you guys peruse this while I discuss my main purposes in what I'm trying to do in this particular study. I'm trying to explain the contents of Senate Bill 90 and also to describe the cutting edge nature of this law. And the other thing is that I want to determine who wanted this bill and why. I always tried to get to, probably not very successfully, but I always tried to get my students to look at the why, the motive. Why are people doing things? They just don't wake up one morning and decide, well, this is what we're going to do. There's a reason for it. So, in particular, burglaries, train robberies, and other acts which would constitute a felony. This is what we don't want to have seen on the screen in Montana. And, of course, it's very relevant. We're still having train robberies, and, we're still having things that people stereotype, the stereotypes that people think about Montana, horse wrestling, wrestling with horses. But you know what I mean? Stealing horses, robbing trains, that sort of thing. Now, there's a couple of weird things about this law that come to mind immediately, for me anyway, and that is there's no mention of sexually suggestive material here. It's all about violence. And you might say, well, Mr. Wells, how much sexual material was in the movies at this time? Well, there were a couple of films that were considered to be provocative. One of which was Edison's The Kiss, which shows it's a close-up of a man and a woman kissing, smooching, and it was produced sometime in the 1890s, I believe, by Edison and the Edison Company. And so a lot of people thought, well, this is not something we want children to see. And the other one would be the Shoe Salesman, which comes from the early 1900s. And in this particular movie, we have a young woman and her chaperone are going shoe shopping. And while the chaperone is engaged in something else, the shoe salesman is busy making out with the young lady. And so there was some, there's some things that people at the time considered to be a little provocative there and a little perhaps over the line. But there's no mention of that in this law. A couple of other things about the law. When you compare it to other laws that you come across, there are no specific penalties for violating the law. They're not listed. This is not unusual. There's a lot of legislation where it's just assumed that the Attorney General of the state or the county attorney is going to pursue these things. So it's not entirely unusual on its own. The second thing is that there is no particular, like I said, there's no officials which are delegated to enforce this law. That's not unusual either. So there's no penalties listed. There's no authorities listed who are supposed to enforce the law. Not particularly unusual, but noticeable. Now, the other thing is that this legislation is kind of connected to that. Did not set up a board to review moving pictures. Later laws are going to do that on the state level and on the city level. So, for example, when Pennsylvania comes along and passes their law in 1911, it's going to have a censorship board. When Chicago comes along and passes its censorship law in November of 1907, it's going to have a censorship board. This law does not. Now, in 1921, there's going to be another bill before the legislature, which is going to try to put in a censorship board for Montana. And that's Senate Bill 109. It failed. It failed. There was a big campaign, big buildup to that law. No buildup to this law, as we'll see, hopefully. And the main reasons why the 1921 law failed was because there were concerns over cost. And there were concerns because it was estimated to be between $35,000 and $40,000 a year to set up this board and pay these folks. And the second thing was bureaucracy. We don't want any more bureaucracy. Very familiar kinds of things here. And so this brings us to one more thing that's remarkable about this law, and that is it seems kind of last minute, doesn't it? It's kind of just the fact that it's a very short text and a lot of things are left out. It seems like it's kind of something that was, yes, they kind of came up with it on a napkin or something. I'm not sure, but this is an important clue as to the circumstances in which this law was passed. As I said, this law is cutting edge. Montana's film censorship law becomes law on March the 2nd, 1907, when the governor signs off on it. And it's only going to be 4 years later when Pennsylvania comes along with their law. But Pennsylvania. I hope there's nobody from Pennsylvania here. But when Pennsylvania does it, it becomes the model for other states. It's kind of like with city commissions. Galveston, Texas, first to have a commission. Does anybody know that? No, it's someplace in Ohio that became the model. So anyway, here we go. A little bit of sarcasm there to brighten your morning. Chicago is going to pass their municipal ordinance, but it's not going to be until November. And Montana's law has already been on the books for 8 months by that time. Now, again, see if I can do this. There we go. There's a generic state capital. I don't know which one that is, and we have all the different states which are going to pass censorship boards or establish censorship boards. And Louisiana is going to come at the very end, and it was never actually put in place. And we go to the cities. A wide variety of cities from all over the country are going to establish censorship boards, including Houston, where I spent my college years and my growing up years. All right. Now, if we look at, well, here's one more for you. Just show the relevance of it. This picture was taken by me. So the topics: acceptance of new technologies, nature versus nurture, protecting vulnerable minds, censorship, all these issues are still relevant today. And probably always will be, quite frankly. All right. So the motivation. Where are the people who wanted this bill? Well, nobody. If we look at the Democratic and Republican platforms for the election cycles of 1904 and 1906, nothing. Surviving letters to Governor Joseph K. Toole, nothing. The only thing that they're concerned about is gambling. Little press coverage at all. It's just kind of a mention here and there as it goes through the process, legislative process. The Methodist Church, there's a lot more work I need to do because there's only these particular institutions have I looked at. But the Methodist Church finally comes along. They're big in reform movements of the period, especially temperance. And they're very closely connected with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They finally come on board and begin to address the issue of morals in the movies about 1925. So that's well after this period. I'm talking about the church in Montana. The Presbyterian Church, they never do come around apparently to seeing this as an issue. They're mostly concerned with temperance. The WCTU began to address the potential negative effects of films about 1911. And they don't actually start to come out in favor of censorship until 1920. Some of you may be saying, well, Mr. Wells, I thought that the WCTU was mostly about temperance. And yes, they were mostly about temperance, but there were a lot of other issues. There was a big anti-cigarette campaign on their part, because we know that cigarettes lead to delinquency. There was a pure literature movement or aspect of the WCTU. There was some talk of environmental concerns, just a little bit, not much. Labor concerns, suffrage. Of course, there's a lot of issues that the WCTU was looking at. So anyway, there's more evidence, more organizations I need to look at. Now, the 10th legislative session of 1907 was, however, very receptive to this legislation. It's just that nobody thought about it, except for one person. And so you can see there are several other laws that were passed, and there's more. This is just what I could fit on a slide. And of other legislation which was passed during the 1907 legislature that was intended to protect children. So the legislature was primed for this sort of thing, and it passed handily both the Senate and the House. Probably the only thing to mention in this regard was that there were 18 members of the House who missed the vote, so there was no serious opposition, but there was a lot of indifference. And there was even more support. So this law sailed through. Okay. Now, this just leaves us with one possible person involved as to this legislation, and this was John N.W. Bielenberg, who is this. This is not what he looked like at the time of 1907, but when he was younger, and so he was a sponsor of the bill, and he was in the Senate representing Deer Lodge in Powell County. He was the Republican, and he was the half-brother of cattle baron Conrad Coors. He himself was also a cattle baron. He was involved in banking and a number of other enterprises. Never married. Didn't have any children, but he was apparently very involved in his brother's children's lives. He cared about his nephews and nieces. He was from Holstein in northern Germany, And they came from a little town about 30 miles from the center of Hamburg. If any of you have ever been to Holstein, you know it's full of cows. And it's very green. And is frequently under Danish control. You don't really think of the Danes as being bullies, but they have been at times. You know, they'd like to take over parts of northern Germany from time to time. And when he was born, they controlled Holstein. Now, I don't think there's any question that there was a progressive movement in Montana. But as K. Ross Toole pointed out, it may not have been as successful as one would hope. So there was that famous debate that he had with another historian. So here are some of the beliefs. There are a lot of beliefs. It depends on what kind of progressive you're talking about. They believed in solving social problems by studying them and forming committees and issuing reports, which then sat on somebody's shelves. Government has a big role in solving social problems. Big business must be monitored to prevent abuses, and altering the environment again in which people live will improve their lives. So here we go. I've been to Deer Lodge a couple of times, not in the prison, but as a tourist here. So they believed, of course, very important for my purposes, that nurture was more important than nature. You see, there I am in the on that.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. There you go. So was Bielenberg a progressive reformer? Well, I don't know. If you look at your list of typical things that a progressive would have, the characteristics that they would have had, we see that they're usually native born. He's an immigrant from Germany. They're Protestants. There's some Jews that are involved in this. The Catholics by this time have sort of given up. They've been kind of working for centuries for improving, for helping vulnerable people. He was a Protestant, a Lutheran, so that fits. They were mostly professionals, lawyers and doctors. He's a cattle baron, businessman, banking. They're mostly urban. He's living in Deer Lodge. I don't know if he counts as being urban, but it certainly was a lot more thriving than it is today, unfortunately. Most of the progressive reformers were middle class. Many were women. Well, obviously he wasn't a woman. And I would say he was rather wealthy. When he passed away, there was a big fight over his estate. Well, okay, so this leaves us with John Bielenberg. Okay, there's nobody else that really is interested in this legislation, and we can look at a couple of aspects of John Bielenberg's experience. Number one, how much of an opportunity did he actually have to see a moving picture if you've been interested in the first place? And unfortunately with Bielenberg, we have no, as far as I know, at least some of you guys know, and if so, I'll be your best friend if you tell me how to get a hold of this stuff. And that is, there doesn't seem to be any personal letters, diaries, anything of John Bielenberg. There's a lot of business records. But he doesn't seem like the Dear Diary type. He seems, kind of rough around the edges. He's a cattle guy and not very sentimental. So I don't know if those records ever existed. We don't really know about whether or not he actually saw a movie ever coming. But nonetheless, we can look at some of the movies that came in. A lot of the movies, of course, we have to use the Silver State, because it was the main newspaper, and it talks a little bit about some of the films that came to Deer Lodge. These were traveling films, and traveling exhibitioners would come and show these films. And the only one that they list as far as content is concerned that we know had violence in it was The Great Train Robbery. And of course, it's one of the first movies to actually have, it's about 12 minutes long. It actually has much of a plot to it. So the earlier movies were just scenes. And this came to Deer Lodge in 1905. The other thing is his personal experience with crime. First of all, let me just kind of show you a couple of pictures that you can look at. This is one of the surviving buildings in Great Falls for one of the early theaters. Yes, 5 minutes. And so it was in here at this time. There was the Gym Theater, and then the Orpheum, and then the Gym Theater. So there were very few places or venues where these films were shown. Now, John's personal experience with crime, well, let's just say there wasn't a whole lot going on in Deer Lodge. The usual sorts of things that young people engage in, particularly young males: vandalism, fighting, trespassing, stealing a keg of beer, that sort of thing. Now, there is one particular thing that occurred that may, I think, have contributed to this particular bill being introduced. Remember, it was introduced on February the 13th of 1907. Well, there was a case that occurred on January the 14th of 1907. We had two juveniles, Frank Carpenter and John Berberick of Anaconda. They went to a ranch while the owner was gone, and they met the caretaker there. The caretaker fed them, and they rewarded him by shooting him 4 times, killing him. Then they blew up the safe using dynamite they had stolen from the railroad in Anaconda. These boys were rapidly apprehended, and they confessed, and some of the causes, this is interesting, that they listed for their crime was obviously needing the money. It's kind of the basis of everything, right? Economics. And a number of other things. But one of the things that stood out was that moving pictures had influenced them to commit this crime. Both the methodology and just the fact of committing it. This was widely reported in the newspapers. So we have the Billings Gazette, the Dillon Examiner, the Helena Independent Record, the Anaconda Standard, all reported this. Now, it's not important for our purposes as to whether or not this was true. This is what people believe was true, which is one thing we need to sort of think about sometimes in history. We get too caught up on what actually happened, but this perception is very important. So I believe that this law was a knee-jerk reaction law that was passed in response to this particular case. Like I said, it was never enforced, but there are going to be continued efforts during the silent period. I don't know about after that, in Montana to censor films. And I honestly believe that these folks had the best of intentions. They may have been a little misguided, but perhaps our standards, but I believe that they were trying to make society better. Thank you.